Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Today we're going to talk about trade-offs, and this is something we don't like to do. I have to just call that out. In the American culture, we don't want to trade off anything. I want this and this. It's all both and. I want to have all the stuff I want, and I want to save a bunch of money, and I want to have plenty of money to give away. These things all are under the same 100% of the resources we have. And by definition, if we don't face the reality that trade-offs require of us, we will end up digging holes that are really difficult to get out of. And so what I want to do today is just frame up for us what trade-offs look like, why they're so hard to identify, but then also how do we start to move in the direction of putting the things down we need to in order to pick up the stuff we really want in life. And so let's start just with this idea of a trade-off. When we think about $1, you can only spend $1 once. And we need to decide with some intentionality how we're going to use that dollar. What are we applying it to? And a lot of times we will preemptively spend dollars. We will finance the spending of $1 by using dollars we don't have, whether that's in a mortgage or a car loan or credit card debt, or we are using dollars we don't have, and we are by definition then ascribing future dollars to paying those dollars back. And what happens a lot of times is we will easily trade off, in our mind, future dollars to pay for current wants. We will figure it out somehow. The problem with future dollars is they don't actually cost us anything. In our mind, they're free. In our mind, they just come out of nowhere. Somehow or another, our income is going to go up to pay for this thing that I've already decided I'm buying. And so that's the trade-off. But at some point, future you is pretty ticked off about that. Future you is facing the reality of the actual trade-off that you made. At some point, you're now in a place where real existing dollars still have to be allocated, and the future dollars that you planned on maybe didn't show up. And so the trade-off gets harder and harder, and yet we keep making this mental gymnastics of assuming the future will somehow pay for the present if we just finance it effectively. And that is a lie that we fall prey to over and over and over again, particularly in our society. In America, it is really easy to make that trade-off. We are constantly trading future dollars for today's wants. We are so inundated with opportunities for free financing, for cheap financing, for constant promise of you'll pay for it eventually, but don't worry, you don't have to make that trade-off now. But what I want us to recognize is, yes, you do, and you already are. When we make those trade-offs, when we have decided to trade a future dollar for a present want, that has now been locked in. We have lost that future dollar. And so we really need to be thoughtful and intentional about how we're making those decisions. When it comes to making decisions around present dollars, those trade-offs actually become more obvious, but they actually become much more painful. So in other words, the future trade-off It doesn't really cost us anything. It's kind of nebulous. We'll just figure it out eventually. We just want to get the thing we want right now. When you get to the future version of you that has to face the reality of what you've traded off, it actually becomes simple arithmetic. This is 100% of my resources. Those resources need to be allocated in certain ways. And if I'm going to save anything, if I'm going to give anything, then that means I have this much left. And so when we think about what we do with those resources, we're really only talking about a few categories. When we think about expenditures, what are we actually applying these dollars to? There are fixed and variable expenses. Fixed expenses are payments that you have to make every month. They're the same. Rent, mortgage, maybe you're paying your property taxes on a monthly basis. Maybe you're paying your insurance payment on a monthly basis. Whatever regularity they are, whether they're monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, it doesn't really matter. If they are the same amount, they are that fixed expense. Fixed does not mean not optional. It just means it's a predictable, consistent amount of money. Variable expenses, those are things that change. Your utility bill is different every month. How much money you spend on gas depends every month on how much you drive that month. The amount of money you spend on groceries, they're variable. It's a changing amount. It's hard to predict. You can kind of average it. You can get a sense of what it should be around, but it's not the same every month. The fact that it's variable does not mean it's optional. Your grocery bill is going to be different every month, but you still need to eat, right? And so we a lot of times we'll think of the things that fluctuate as being where there's cuts, where we just need to cut those things because they're different every month. And if we can just control those things, if we can just eliminate the variable things, then somehow we'll have enough to pay for the fixed expenses. And this is the trap we get into. We think a trade-off is rooted in cutting variable expenses in order to afford our fixed expenses. Because the truth is, our fixed expenses are easy for us to calculate. We know we need at least this much to pay all those fixed expenses because they're super predictable and understandable. But this is the trap that we fall in all the time, is if we just cut enough variable expenses. But those variable expenses many times are still required. They're not optional. And then we wonder why we weren't able to cut enough. And we beat ourselves up because we're just not able to get this right because we're thinking about it wrong. Where the real trade-offs happen is in a different categorization, and that's discretionary versus non-discretionary. Another way to think of it is optional versus required. We can have discretionary expenses that are fixed. Things like a cable bill or a Netflix subscription or a cell phone plan that's really high, right? Those things are predictable. They're fixed. We know they're there, but they're still optional. They're still discretionary. We could do without them. You could live without your Netflix subscription. I know that's really hard to believe, but you could. You could live without that Disney Plus subscription. You could live without these things. They're fixed, but that does not mean they're required. Simply because we know what they are, a lot of times we just throw them in a category of these are my basic bills. They're just the deal. And the variable stuff is where we find ourselves thinking all the cuts have to happen. But many of those are non-discretionary. They are required. Your utility bill, it's going to be different every month. You better pay it. Your water bill is going to change every month. Your grocery amount is going to change every month, but these are not optional. You need those things, right? And so the biggest change that we need to make is recognizing where the trade-offs need to happen. Sometimes when we really understand how life adds up and what those numbers are, we end up in a situation where most of the trade-offs that need to happen are in the fixed expenses. And some of those are also non-discretionary. So in other words, we may say, look, the only way this math works is if we reduce our housing costs. And this is a conversation. I had a great email from one of our listeners that I love the question. The question was, why do you guys recommend that housing be so small a percentage of your income? At Good Sense, we're aiming at 20 to 25% of your gross income is aimed at your housing costs, which is low. And we recognize that, especially if you're in California or some other state, the cost of housing is really, really high. And I understand that this benchmark that we throw out is low, but we need to recognize that there's only 100% to go around. And so the bank will tell you that you can afford way more than that. You could finance as much as 36% of your gross income on just your mortgage payment, right? They'll say it's fine, you can afford it. But they're assuming that you're not saving, that you're not giving, that you're not living with any margin. They assume you're never actually having any fun or doing anything that you enjoy, but you'll be able to afford that house if you don't do any of that stuff. They're making the trade-off for you by convincing you that that's an affordable house. And if you listen to the bank will tell you to buy something that by definition has traded everything else away. You don't have anything else. Because if we think about the way this math works, if at least 20% of our income is going to taxes, including FICA and all those other things, local, state, whatever you might have. So let's say that's 20%. If we're saving 10% and we're giving 10%, that's another 20. All right, so we're already up to 40% that has to go out the door to those things. And so that means that if we throw 36% on top of that for housing, we're left with less than 30% of our income to actually spend on things like food and transportation and cars and gas. And it's insane. We can't fit it all in. And so that's the problem. We end up being forced into trade-offs we never actually were intentional about, because we just assume this rule of thumb that's based on never giving a dime away and saving very little, if any, is affordable. And so sometimes the first trade-off we have to make is right-sizing some of those costs. When we understand that we have overbought in our housing situation, there's not enough in that variable expense category. You can't cut groceries and eating out enough to make up for the fact that this is too big. And so sometimes that trade-off is in a fixed, non-discretionary area. We just got to move a big rock. We got to get our housing costs down. Sometimes it's a fixed discretionary area. Hey, we bought this car, we leased this car, we love this brand new car, and it smells great, right? That new car smell is addictive, but it's too expensive. We can't afford it. We need to downsize. We need to downgrade. We need to only have one car as a family, whatever that may be. We think of these fixed expenses as non-negotiable, as required, but they're not. And so we need to evaluate those things. Those are trade-offs we need to make. On the other side of the equation, we also need to make sure that we are managing our variable and non-discretionary spending. So grocery bills and things like that, gas. How are we managing towards limiting what we're spending on those things, but recognize they are required? We can't eliminate them. And so trade-offs are rooted in the fact that we have 100% of these dollars to allocate, and we need to make sure that we're allocating them across these different categories in a way that makes sense. And if we're going to pick this up, we have to put these things down. And unfortunately, a lot of times what we pick up are things like bigger houses and nicer cars, and what we put down is generosity. And I want to argue that that is not faithful stewardship. We want to be in a place where we are maximizing generosity, where we are honoring God with all of his resources. And sometimes that looks like driving a car that's not as nice or living in a house that's not as big in order to hold that margin and be able to be ready to either save and prepare for future obedience or give those resources away to people who are in pain. That is what these trade-offs ultimately lead to. They free up that margin that allows us to do the things that God has been calling us to. The beauty of trade-offs is they actually lead us to freedom. We think that it's restriction and self-denial, and it is those things. But the other side of it is less fear, less anxiety, and more confidence to say yes when God says, use some of my resources for this person, this family, this cause. And we get to link arms with the King of the universe to do the work he's up to because we've put ourselves in a position where we've been willing to make the trade-offs that give us the margin to confidently say yes when he calls. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you.